Hello, this is Adam with the Gwinnett County Public Library. In honor of Pride Month, today I would like to talk to you about the difficult life and the troubled novels of Yukio Mishima, the most celebrated and the most infamous Japanese author of the 20th century, and one of the most important LGBT authors in world literature. Yukio Mishima was born a gay man in Imperial Japan at the height of its militarism and machismo, and to make matters worse, was subjected to countless episodes of physical and emotional abuse by his family. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who were obsessed with writing still, objective, and sterile pieces of high art, Yukio Mishima poured himself and all his pain and bitterness and hardship into his work, creating novels that are emotionally severe and, to put it politely, opinionated. Today, we're going to be focusing on the novels that he wrote throughout the 1950s and 60s, many of which are semi-autobiographical tales from his childhood, explorations of his sexuality, and gloomy ruminations on the relationship between death and beauty. What makes a Mishima novel so special is the contrast between its dark themes and its gorgeous prose. Mishima has a way of making a character say or think something completely evil, but delivered through a Trojan horse of clever, aesthetic, and often breathtakingly beautiful writing. To me, this effect makes reading a Mishima novel kind of like staring at a dangerous but graceful tornado. You can tell that there's something terrible happening deep in the book's pages, but you find yourself staring in awe anyway. This interplay between beauty and darkness is the core of Mishima's signature style of writing, but it was also how he lived his life. Like a grim Don Quixote, some speculate that Mishima may have had difficulty separating fantasy from reality, a trait that may have contributed to the magical qualities of his novels, which also led to his engagement in a series of artistic but provocative publicity stunts, which escalated in their severity. In the last of these stunts, Mishima would stage a coup against the Japanese government, seemingly just so that he could have a grand stage on which to make his exit from life. In this video, we're going to be discussing Yukio Mishima's life and taking a walk through some of his most important novels. But before we dive any deeper, please keep in mind that any discussion about Yukio Mishima will be at least lightly touching on some heavy and upsetting subjects, such as death, abuse, and suicide. I would also like to say that outside of his novels, Yukio Mishima was an infamous provocateur and held political views that were controversial even in his own time and place. This video should not be considered an endorsement of his actions or opinions, and is rather just a tour of his masterfully written novels and his unusual life. And with that out of the way, let's get started. Yukio Mishima is actually a pen name. Mishima was born in 1925 to a family of bureaucrats as Kimitake Hiraoka, and he was born incredibly frail. When he was just a month old, young Kimitake was forcibly separated from his parents and held captive by his grandmother, who was haughty, controlling, and prone to outbursts of violence. Citing Kimitake's frailty, his grandmother forbade him from playing sports, from seeing other boys his age, and even from venturing out of their home. Supposedly, it was rare that he was ever even allowed to see the sun. In his grandmother's oppressive shadow, Kimitake spent the first 12 years of his childhood in almost complete isolation. For most of his childhood, he was a prisoner. This period of solitude was made even more cruel after his grandmother became terminally ill, leaving him trapped in a room filled with death. By the time young Kimitake was finally reunited with his parents at the age of 12, he returned to them with his thoughts fixated on death and mortality, obsessions that would intensify as his life went on. It was around this time that Kimitake began writing stories, and even from this young age, death was irrevocably woven into his work. Although Kimitake was released from his grandmother's iron grip, life with his parents would turn out to be only marginally better. His mother was a passionate supporter of his writing, but his father was violently opposed to his son's interest in such a feminine hobby. His father would frequently raid Kimitake's belongings for evidence of his stories, ripping anything that he found to shreds. Throughout his teenage years, Kimitake had to keep his sexuality, as well as his writing, a closely guarded secret. In 1941, at the age of 16, one of Kimitake's short stories, a story called Forest in Full Bloom, came to the hands of a Japanese literary magazine. They were blown away by what they read, and believing they had found a genius in young Kimitake, enthusiastically published Forest in Full Bloom in their magazine. Understanding Kimitake's situation with his father and respecting his need for secrecy, The owners of the magazine came up with a pseudonym for the young man, Yukio Mishima, a name that he would use for the rest of his life and a name by which we still remember him today. In the 1940s, in his late teens and early 20s, several things happened to Yukio Mishima that intensified the darkness that his grandmother planted in his heart. For starters, going into World War II, Mishima had become convinced that he was going to die in the war. However, because his body was so frail, he ultimately wasn't allowed to fight. The unit that Mishima was supposed to serve in was decimated, and learning this seems like it may have transformed Mishima's feelings from "I'm going to die" to "I'm supposed to be dead," a theme that comes up in his later work. As if this weren't enough, in the last year of the war, Mishima was devastated by the death of both his sister and his mentor, who were both very dear to him. In this way, Mishima's obsession with death would only intensify, and many of the short stories that he wrote in the year following the end of the war were especially obsessed with suicide. However, in all the desolation surrounding Mishima's life, there were some silver linings in his literary career. For one, he had finally earned his father's reluctant approval of his writing. And secondly, his dark stories following his sister's death were noticed by Yasunari Kawabata, another of Japan's literary masters, who became Mishima's new mentor. It was Confessions of a Mask, Mishima's second novel, and published in 1948, that propelled him to fame. Confessions of a Mask tells the story of Kochan, a young gay man who is forced to wear a fake personality as a mask in order to fit in with the rigid and militaristic culture of Imperial Japan. In the novel, Kochan spends much of his childhood in captivity in his grandmother's residence. In the isolation of her house, his imagination blooms, and he conjures up stories of medieval fairy tales and knights. However, his imagination often goes too far, and he finds his fantasies exploring death and destruction, obsessions that begin to affect how he views the world. Sound familiar? This is one of the first of Mishima's semi-autobiographical novels, and is a barely fictionalized account of his own childhood. Confessions of a Mask, and its, at the time, controversial exploration of sexuality, made Mishima a celebrity overnight. In the wake of his success, he was able to, for the first time, fully devote himself to writing. He published another important novel in 1951 called Forbidden Colors, which, to me, was one of his darkest novels. It depicts a young gay man named Yuichi who possesses breathtaking beauty. Like Mishima in his own life, Yuichi is forced into an arranged marriage with a woman and is consequently forced to keep his sexuality a secret. The other principal character in the novel is Shinsuke, an elderly, misogynistic author who becomes a kind of mentor for Yuichi. Shinsuke is looking for a way to take vengeance against all womankind, and in Yuichi, his young protege, he finds a way. Shinsuke weaponizes Yuichi's sexuality by manipulating numerous women into falling in love with him, not realizing he's actually gay. To Shinsuke, trapping these women in an unreciprocated and loveless affair with the beautiful young man is his ultimate vengeance. Forbidden Colors can be a difficult read for some, as it was for me, because the misanthropic character of Shinsuke is almost overpoweringly vile. However, through Yuichi's eyes, Mishima shows us what the underground LGBT world of Japan was like at the time, with all of its rituals and signals and secret meeting places hiding themselves in plain sight. Through Yuichi, Mishima also performs an exploration of the relationship between his own sexuality and his masculinity, pondering the compatibility of the two, and I found these chapters to be really interesting. Even in the darkest chapters of Forbidden Colors, the ones that delve into Shinsuke's most venomous thoughts, the prose is still as clever and gorgeous as always. My personal introduction to Mishima was through finding his 1954 novel, The Sound of Waves, which, after the barely contained venom of Forbidden Colors, is a surprisingly simple and sweet love story set on a remote Japanese island. Really, the only thing to say about this novel, beyond the fact that it's really good, is that the traditional life it depicts and idealizes foreshadows Mishima's future political obsessions, which we'll discuss near the end of the video. But on its own, The Sound of Waves is personally my favorite out of everything that Mishima wrote. Returning to his usual dark style, in his 1956 novel, The Temple of the Golden Pavilion, which is based on a true story, Mishima depicts a Buddhist monk who becomes obsessed with the Golden Pavilion, a beautiful Buddhist temple that had been miraculously spared from destruction several times over the centuries, but which is beginning to show signs of its age. When the United States began to firebomb Japanese cities in World War II, The monk had become convinced that the beautiful temple would be burned to the ground. When the war ends, the monk realizes that the temple is still standing. He decides to burn it down himself in order to preserve its beauty. Around this time, this idea that beautiful things shouldn't be allowed to be ruined by age began to consume Mishima. In 1955, just a year before Golden Pavilion was published, Mishima, who had always had a frail body, took up bodybuilding so that he could give himself a physique that could withstand the march of time and preserve his body's beauty for as long as possible. In the 1960s, Mishima, who had always been controversial for the content of his novels, became even more controversial as he began to become politically active. He became a part of a right-wing movement that was fixated on reinstating the emperor as Japan's head of state and on removing the influence of the United States from the country, which Mishima saw as having made Japan weak and overly materialistic. In 1968, he founded the Shield Society, a private militia led by himself and staffed mostly by university students that he recruited. He continued to write as prolifically as ever, and was even nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature 3 times in the 60s, but his political activities began to seep into and affect the focus of his novels. Despite this, there are still some highlights from the period, such as Star and The Frolic of the Beasts, that continue in his early style, and I recommend giving them a try. His final work, a 4-part series of novels called The Sea of Fertility, is considered his magnum opus. The series spans from the 1910s to the 70s, and tells the story of a man who grows up to see his childhood friend reincarnated several times. Since the series takes place over the course of nearly 60 years, The Sea of Fertility is a large canvas on which Mishima plays with a wide variety of themes, and on which he reflects on Japanese life in the 20th century. The final book in the Sea of Fertility series was called The Decay of the Angel, and on November 25th, 1970, his last day alive, Mishima sent the manuscript forward off to his publisher. Just a week before, he had written in a letter that, to me, finishing The Decay of the Angel is nothing more than the end of the world. After sending off the manuscript, Mishima gathered his Shield Society, his militia, and stormed a Japanese military base, where he gave a passionate speech in an attempt to incite the soldiers there to revolt against the Japanese government. When he was laughed off the stage by the soldiers, he and his lovers retreated and took their lives. In the 50 years that have since passed, there's been an ongoing debate about whether or not Yukio Mishima's coup attempt was a sincere political action or just a stunt he pulled so that he could have as grand a stage as possible in which to make his exit from life. Either way, between his masterfully written novels and his dramatic, controversial end, Mishima still remains an imposing figure in the worlds of Japanese and LGBT literature even half a century later.